Ned lived at the edge of the village where the trees grew tall and the path turned to dirt. His cabin was small. One room, one window, one door. A stack of wood outside and a cold fireplace most nights. He had lived there alone for 6 years, ever since his wife passed. The villagers knew him as a quiet man. He waved when he passed them in the market. He never caused trouble. He never asked for much. He liked it that way. That evening, Ned had just finished his supper. A bit of bread, some boiled meat, and a cup of water. Nothing fancy. He scraped the leftover scraps into a cloth and stood up to toss them out the back. That was when he heard it. A sound near the front door. Not a knock. More like a scratch. Low and slow, like something dragging its weight across the wood. Ned set the cloth down and picked up the small iron poker near the fireplace. Not to attack. Just to feel safer. He walked to the door slowly and pulled it open. He expected a stray dog. Maybe a fox. What he found was something else entirely. A dragonling stood on his doorstep. It was small, barely the height of his knee. Its scales were a dull gray, dusty and dry, not the clean shine that healthy young dragons carried. Its wings were folded tight against its sides. Its ribs showed faintly through the skin. One of its back legs trembled slightly as it stood there, staring up at him with yellow eyes that caught the last light of the evening sun. It did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It just looked at him. Ned stood very still. He had seen dragons before, adults, mostly, circling the northern hills from far away. He had never been this close to one. Not even a young one. Every person in the village knew the rule. You do not approach wild dragons. You do not feed them. You do not give them any reason to come near the village. He knew all of that. He also knew what hunger looked like. Ned stepped back slowly, reached for the cloth of scraps on the table, and walked back to the door. He tossed a piece of boiled meat onto the ground in front of the dragonling. The creature flinched when it landed. Then it looked at the meat. Then it looked at Ned. Then it ate. Quickly, the way starving things always eat, not with pleasure, but with need. Ned tossed another piece. Then another. The dragonling ate every one. When the cloth was empty, it lifted its head and looked at him one more time. Then it turned and disappeared into the dark trees without a sound. Ned stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went inside and closed the door. He did not sleep well that night. The next morning he was splitting wood behind the cabin when Walt came by. Walt was the oldest man in the village. White hair, slow walk, sharp eyes. He had seen more trouble than most people in the village combined, and he was not shy about saying so. He stood at the edge of Ned's yard and looked at him with those sharp eyes. "I heard you fed something last night," Walt said. Ned kept splitting wood. "News travels fast. In this village it does." Walt crossed his arms. "Was it a dragonling?" Ned set down the axe. "It was hungry." Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ned. You know what feeding a wild dragonling means. It comes back. Then it brings others. Then you have a problem you cannot fix with a poker and a cloth of scraps." "It was just one piece of meat," Ned said. "It is never just one piece." Walt looked at the tree line. "Leave it alone. Whatever it is, it belongs to the hills. Not to you." Ned nodded slowly. Walt gave him one last look, then turned and walked back toward the village. Ned watched him go. Then he went inside, cut a piece of dried meat from the strip hanging by the window, wrapped it in cloth, and walked to the tree line at the edge of his yard. He set it on the ground near the first tree. He did not know why exactly. It was not a smart thing to do. Walt was not wrong. He knew that. But that image stayed with him. Those yellow eyes. Those visible ribs. That trembling leg. He went back inside and got to work. The scrap was gone the next morning. Ned noticed it when he went out to start his work. The cloth was still there, sitting in the dirt near the first tree, but it was empty and slightly torn at one edge. Something had taken the meat clean out of it during the night. He picked up the cloth and went back inside without a word. That evening he left another piece. Gone by morning. He did not tell anyone. There was nothing to tell, really. A scrap of meat disappearing in the night could have been anything. A fox. A stray dog. A bird. He told himself that and went about his days. But on the fourth night, he heard the scratch at the door again. Ned was still awake, sitting near the fireplace with a small cup of warm tea. He heard it and sat still for a moment. Then he got up, took the piece of meat he had already set aside on the table, and opened the door. Ash was there. He decided then to call her that. He did not know if she was a she. He just felt it somehow, the way you sometimes do with animals. She stood in the same spot as before, same dusty scales, same yellow eyes. But this time she did not flinch when the door opened. She had been expecting him. Ned crouched down slowly so he was not so tall above her. He held the meat out in his open hand rather than tossing it. Ash looked at the hand for a long time. Then she stepped forward and took the meat carefully from his palm. Her teeth were small but sharp. She did not nick his skin. She was gentle about it in a way that surprised him. She ate and left. Ned closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment. He smiled without meaning to. After that she came every 2 or 3 nights. Always at dusk or just after. Always to the front door. Ned started keeping a small piece of dried meat or cooked scraps ready each evening. He did not make a fuss about it. He just made sure something was there. Slowly, very slowly, she began to stay longer. At first she would eat and go. Then she started sitting for a few minutes near the doorstep before leaving. Ned learned not to move too much during those minutes. No sudden gestures. No loud sounds. He would crouch or sit on the step and just be there with her. Not pushing. Not reaching. Just present. It took about 2 weeks before he noticed the wound. He saw it one evening when she turned to leave. A gash on her left foreleg, just above the joint. It was not fresh but it was not healed either. The skin around it looked dark and slightly swollen. She was favoring that leg, putting less weight on it when she walked, though she was trying not to show it. Ned did not reach for it that night. He just looked and said nothing. The next evening he brought out the meat as usual but also set a small cloth soaked in the herbal wash he used for his own cuts beside him on the step. He let her eat first. Then he held the cloth loosely in his hand and waited. Ash looked at the cloth. She looked at him. She looked at the cloth again. Ned did not move toward her. He just kept his hand open and low. After a long moment, Ash stepped closer and sniffed the cloth. Then she sat down and stretched the wounded foreleg forward slightly. Just slightly. As if she was not sure about it but had decided to try. Ned moved slowly. He pressed the cloth gently against the wound and held it there for a few seconds. Ash went very still. She did not pull away. Her yellow eyes watched him the whole time but she did not move. He cleaned it as carefully as he could. Then he sat back and that was that. She left a few minutes later but she looked back once from the tree line before disappearing. By then the village had noticed. Ned could not say exactly when it started but people were watching. Not openly. A glance from a neighbor over the fence. A pause from someone walking past on the path. Marge, who ran the village store, stopped him one morning and asked plainly if it was true he had a dragonling coming to his door at night. Ned said he would not call it that exactly. Marge looked at him the way people look at someone doing something they consider quietly foolish. "Walt already told you," she said. "He did," Ned agreed. She waited for more. Ned had nothing more to add. He thanked her and kept walking. That evening Ash came again. The wound on her foreleg looked better. The swelling had gone down. She ate her meat, sat on the step for a while, and let Ned check the wound one more time. The whispers in the village grew louder. Ned kept showing up. For 6 nights Ash did not come. Ned noticed after the second night but said nothing to anyone. He kept the meat ready each evening and sat by the door for a while before going to bed. The step stayed empty. The tree line stayed dark and quiet. By the 4th night he started to worry. Not the loud kind of worry that makes a person pace and talk. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in the chest and does not leave. He ate his supper without tasting it. He slept poorly. He woke before sunrise and lay in the dark listening to nothing. On the 6th morning he made a decision. He packed a cloth bag with what he had. Some dried meat. A small jar of the herbal wash. A strip of clean bandage he used for his own cuts. A bit of bread. He pulled on his heavy coat because the air had turned cold in the last few days and the northern hills held their chill long after the sun came up. He followed the trail. He had never gone past the first line of trees before. He had always stayed at the edge, always let Ash come to him. But he knew the direction she always came from. Always the same gap between 2 large oaks at the north end of the tree line. Always from the left side of the hill path beyond them. He went that way. The trees were dense and the ground sloped upward quickly. He walked for nearly an hour before the land dipped down again and he found himself at the top of a narrow ravine. The walls were steep rock on both sides with a thin stream running along the bottom. Cold air sat in it like water in a bowl. He heard something before he saw anything. A low sound. Not a growl. More like a slow steady breath coming from below. He moved carefully down the slope, holding onto rocks and roots to keep his footing. At the bottom, tucked under a wide flat shelf of rock that jutted out from the ravine wall, he found them. Ash was there. She was curled around 2 smaller dragonlings, her wings spread low over them like a tent. The 2 little ones were pale and thin, even smaller than Ash had been the first night she came to his door. They lay pressed against each other with their eyes closed. One of them was shivering steadily. The other had a faint rattling sound in its breathing that Ned did not like at all. Ash looked up when she heard him come down. She did not growl. But she went very still and her yellow eyes locked onto him and did not move. Her body stayed curved around the 2 small ones. Protective. Ready. Ned stopped where he was. He crouched down slowly and set the bag on the ground in front of him. He opened it without rushing and took out the dried meat. He set a piece on the ground and slid it gently forward with one hand. Then he sat back and waited. Ash watched him for a long moment. Then she looked at the meat. Then back at him. She reached forward and took it. Ned let out a slow quiet breath. He understood now. This was where the scraps had been going. Not just to Ash. Ash had been taking what he left at the tree line and carrying it back here. Stretching it across 3 mouths. Keeping these 2 little ones alive on whatever she could gather while they were too sick to move. She had been doing that alone. Every night. Without a sound. He moved closer slowly over the next hour, stopping each time Ash tensed, waiting until she settled again before moving another step. By midday he was close enough to look at the 2 smaller ones properly. The shivering one had a deep cut along its side, hidden under a fold of wing. Old and badly closed. The one with the rattling breath had its throat swollen on one side, tight and warm to the touch when Ned finally got close enough to check. He worked carefully and quietly. He cleaned the cut with the herbal wash and wrapped it as best he could with the bandage strip. For the swollen throat he had little but warm water and soft small pieces of meat that he left within easy reach. He did not go home that night. He built no fire. He sat with his back against the ravine wall, coat pulled tight, and stayed. The second day the shivering slowed. The third morning the rattling in the small one's breath was nearly gone. By the third evening both little ones had opened their eyes and eaten on their own for the first time. Ash looked at Ned across the dim ravine. She did not make a sound. She did not need to. He nodded once and pulled his coat tighter against the cold. The village knew before Ned even got back. He was not sure how. Perhaps someone had seen him leave that morning with the bag. Perhaps Walt had noticed the cold fireplace through the window. Perhaps it was simply the way news moves in small places, quietly, quickly, and already changed a little by the time it reaches the last ear. When Ned walked back through the village on the fourth morning, tired and stiff from 3 nights against a cold ravine wall, 3 people stopped what they were doing and watched him pass. No one said good morning. One woman pulled her child closer without thinking about it. Ned walked home, washed his face, and slept for most of the day. He woke to a knock at his door. It was Walt. Behind him stood Marge and 2 other men from the village council. All 4 of them had the same look. Not angry exactly. Something closer to decided. Ned stepped back and let them in. They stood in his small room and looked around the way people do when they are not really looking at the room but at the person who lives in it. Marge was the one who spoke first. She was a sturdy woman with gray streaks in her hair and a voice that did not waste words. She told him what people were saying. That he had gone into the northern hills alone. That he had spent 3 nights in dragon territory. That he had been feeding a wild dragonling for weeks and now apparently more than one. She paused and looked at him steadily. The council has talked, she said. We want it to stop. No more food left at the tree line. No more going into the hills. No more contact with whatever is out there. Are we understood? The room was quiet. Ned sat down in his chair by the cold fireplace. He was still tired. His back ached from the ravine ground and his hands were rough from the cold. He looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up at Marge. I hear you, he said. Good, Marge said. Can I say something? Ned asked. Marge nodded once. Ned was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know what to say but because he wanted to say it right. He was not a man who spoke much and he did not want to start an argument. That was not what this was. There were 3 of them, he said. Out in that ravine. 2 little ones, sick and cold. Ash had been feeding them on her own with what I left at the tree line. One of them had a cut that was going bad. The other could barely breathe. He paused. I am not saying dragons are safe. I am not saying bring them into the village or make friends with the whole hillside. I know what they are. He looked at Marge, then at Walt. But those 2 little ones were going to die out there alone. And I had medicine in a jar and food in a bag and 2 legs to carry them there. He opened his hands on his knees. I cannot pretend I did not see that. I have tried to figure out how a person does that and I cannot work it out. The room stayed quiet. Walt looked at the floor. One of the council men shifted his weight. Marge kept her eyes on Ned with an expression that was hard to read. It is not about what you saw, she said finally. It is about what comes next. You feed them, they come back. They come back, they come closer. They come closer and one bad night this whole village pays for your soft heart. That is possible, Ned said. I will not tell you it is not. Marge waited for the rest. There was no rest. That was all Ned had. He stood up slowly, opened the door, and looked at them. I appreciate you coming, he said simply. They left. Walt was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Ned for a moment with those sharp old eyes. Something moved across his face that was not quite agreement and not quite disapproval. Then he walked away without a word. Ned closed the door and stood in the quiet. By evening the village had split down the middle. Half thought the council was right. Half thought Ned had only done what any decent person would have done and that sick dragonlings were hardly the threat that grown wild ones were. Nobody agreed on anything. Ned lit his fireplace, ate a quiet supper, and left a small scrap of meat at the tree line before going to bed. It started as a sound. Low and steady, coming from the north before the sun had fully risen. Not thunder. Not wind. Something more rhythmic than either of those things. A deep rolling beat that moved through the ground as much as through the air, the kind of sound that a person feels in the chest before the ears understand it. Ned was outside splitting wood when he heard it. He stopped and straightened and looked toward the northern hills. The sky above the tree line was moving. Not clouds. Wings. Dozens of them, wide and dark against the pale morning sky, beating slow and steady as the whole herd came down from the hills together. Large ones and small ones. Old ones with scarred wings and young ones flying tight beside them. They moved in a wide loose group, not chaotic, not rushing, simply coming forward the way a tide comes in. Unhurried and certain. Ned set down his axe. Behind him he heard the village waking to it. Doors opening. Voices cutting short. The sound of people stepping outside and going still. The herd did not circle. They came straight down from the hills and landed at the tree line at the northern edge of the village in a long quiet line. One after another, settling onto the ground without noise, folding their wings, and standing still. And at the front of them all stood Ash. She was easy to pick out. Ned would have known her anywhere by now. Her gray scales, her particular way of holding her head slightly to one side when she was watching something carefully. She stood at the center of the tree line and she was looking directly at him across the open ground. Beside her, close to her left side, stood two smaller dragonlings. Their scales were brighter than Ash's, catching the early light. They stood steady on all four legs, no trembling, no labored breathing. They looked out at the village with wide calm eyes. Ned walked forward. He heard someone behind him say his name sharply. Marge probably. Maybe Walt. He did not stop. He crossed the open ground between his cabin and the tree line slowly and steadily, hands open at his sides, and came to a stop about 10 feet from Ash. The herd was enormous up close. He had not understood from a distance how large some of the adults were. The ones at the edges of the line were bigger than his cabin. Their eyes caught him from every direction, gold and amber and dark green, all watching, all still. Not one of them moved. Ash looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. From the center of the herd, an elder came forward. It was the largest dragon Ned had ever seen. Its scales were deep gray, nearly black at the edges, worn smooth in places from age. One of its horns had a long crack running through it from some old fight or fall. It moved slowly, not from weakness but from the particular unhurried weight of something very old. It walked through the line until it stood directly before Ned with only a few feet between them. Ned did not step back. The elder looked at him for what felt like a very long time. Those eyes were darker than Ash's, deeper, like looking into still water at night. There was something in them that Ned could not name. Not warmth exactly. Something older than warmth. Then the elder lowered its head. All the way down. Slow and deliberate, until its chin nearly touched the ground. Held it there for a full moment. Then it raised its head again and looked at him once more. Ned felt something move through him that he had no word for. He lowered his own head in return. Simple and quiet. The only answer he had. The elder held his gaze one moment longer. Then it turned and walked back through the line. One by one the rest of the herd turned with it. No sound. No signal that Ned could see. They simply rose together, slowly, wings opening wide, and lifted back toward the northern hills until the sky was empty again. Ash did not go with them. She walked forward and sat down beside Ned in the morning light. The two smaller dragonlings settled close behind her. All three of them looked out at the village together. Ned stood among them and said nothing. Behind him the village was completely silent. No treaty was written after that day. No agreement was spoken out loud. But through every hard winter that followed, deer never went scarce in the eastern woods. Wolves never came close to the village at night. And whenever late frost threatened the crops in early spring, it stopped at the edge of the valley as if something unseen had drawn a quiet line around it. Walt lived another 9 years after that morning. He never once admitted Ned had been right. But he stopped warning him about the tree line.